Nice, I feel good. These are exquisitely beautiful things. They have served the field of neurobiology even before neurobiology existed. Since the very early days of neurology, these representations, these drawings, had extraordinary explanatory power and have been used and fetishized, etc., forever and ever. In any case, there we go. I wanted to get past the whole neurobiology thing. It was so well, let's say, presented to you on the first day of this conference by Warren. We find it, the psychotropy movement, the cultural psychotropy movement, we find it in global avant-garde culinary practice that targets human nervous response across several, if not all, of its modalities at once, and seeks to extract and transmit increasingly cryptic and refined flavors and sensations from the surrounding environment to the brain in the most striking and expectation-defying way possible. And there we see 4 plates from the Noma restaurant of René Redzepi. It's essentially based in many ways on foraging in the immediate environment, an environment that would be, well, considered a little bit resistant, if you like, to finding delicious things in it in the northern, Scandinavian environment. At least, of course, in summer it's full of things, but in winter, anyway, you see here eating lichens and mosses, as well as the presentation that I'm sure is very disturbing for people of the entire organism of the duck. He looks like he's just been electrocuted on a wire. We find it in much current art practice that reaches beyond the familiar phenomenologies toward an apotheosis, no longer of the object or the subject, the art is the object, the art object, but of the constitutive and founding act of perception itself. These are 3 random almost works of the artist Robert Irwin. Irwin's project, in a way, begins, or you could say has its roots, in self-modulating neurological practice from the sensory deprivation, not tanks, but the sensory deprivation rooms in which he, in many ways, trained and tuned his nervous system in the early years while he was searching for a new modality of production. And then, of course, the perhaps all too familiar, but nonetheless extraordinary works and projects of Olafur Eliasson of Copenhagen, Berlin, whose essential project, in a way, is to trick the brain into taking its own operations as its object of experience. And that's an extraordinary and psychotropic project in my mind. We find it, the psychotropic movement, cultural psychotropy movement, in the philosophy of history, in what is known as the deep history movement that posits somatic states, what they call them, somatic states, feelings, moods, predispositions, and the organization and modification of the human physical and social surround in order precisely to affect and engender these states, these changed and altered states, as the original and final object of human history. They call it neurohistory and posit psychotropy, the word itself, the very term our conference today is using as its sole object of study. What's notable and important is that in each and every case, the psychotropic term is presented as a corrective practice, one that reverses one or another bias of modernist reductionism and rationalization, be it the prejudice of writing as the origin of human history and culture, which is rejected, The cult of Ersatz digitally mediated sociality, a common molester of contemporary forms of mental life. The routinization and separation of the senses through bureaucratization of the body, of the entire capacity of the body to feel. The sensual disaffection and separation of cooking and the manipulation, if you like, of the edible environment from the evolutionary, generative, and chemical processes that pullulate, good luck, translators, throughout our ambient ecology. And just flourish, if you like, throughout our ambient ecology. In the most systematic context, that of Daniel Smale and the deep history partisans, psychotropic historiography seeks to identify the plethora of non-cognitive aspects of neural functioning and how these very practices, if you like, pattern culture and the external environment through the establishment of practices, habits, institutions, and atmospheres that stabilize our attention, feelings, and their associated chemistries. It's an extraordinary project, really, to connect the body right down to its molecular level to all of grand history itself. It also goes without saying that this includes the broad panoply of substances that we manufacture, circulate, and ingest, such as alcohol, caffeine, tea, opiates, chocolate, chili peppers, sugar, tobacco, spices, nitrous oxide, etc. By the same token, we are asked to consider if practices such as religious liturgies, gossip, sports, sex, music, shopping, pornography. But pornography is not really my own entry into this, but I'm amazed how often Smale includes it in his writing. Politics, education and military training, nationalist activism, or even art and architecture, or television, chanting, yoga, breathwork, fasting, and on and on and on. These represent anything else but means of modulating internal physical states. In past decades, we had a different word for this. I mean recent past decades, with a different flavor, but one that covered nearly as much ground, that of subjectivity. I realize this word is still somewhat alive in the world of art and art theory. It's pretty much vanished, I find, from my field. I'm a design theorist, but even increasingly from humanities. Broadly speaking, and even in the still well-known, influential work, The Three Ecologies by Félix Guattari, the three overlapping circles of historical material existence includes the curiously non-physical psychic ecology that somehow both anchors and is embedded within the other two, the social world and the natural world. In some, and for those requiring a demonstrable link in the... you know what, I'm going to skip these. Now stay tuned, interpreters. All right, next paragraph. I didn't warn like this part. I want to get to the part that I like. Yeah, that's where I want to go. Okay, but beyond these frameworks, already well established in our institutions, in our public and cultural life, our schools, restaurants, entertainment complexes, and so on, and undoubtedly highly consonant and preparatory for more extreme forms of psychotropic, therapeutic, aesthetic, and ecological militancy, is the undeniable sudden and recent surge in interest and resource allocation toward the disciplined and instrumental use of psychedelic and entheogenic substances in a variety of new settings. These latter developments mostly fall into the broad category of research, medical research, but also personal, spiritual, religious, and mystical. What the hell do these terms really mean? Medical clearly suggests a soma, a body, or a pathological state of that body. A materia medica, either material or immaterial, it could be talk therapy, for example. And a body of pharmacological knowledge and practice that addresses and systematizes these transformations. I will not address this dimension in too great detail today, other than simply to remind ourselves that we do not yet understand how aspirin works, and more broadly, that a great deal of chemical medicine remains a black box affair in which an agent is introduced into the body and an effect is induced out, utterly absent of broader explanation. The point I make here is that modern medicine remains, despite itself, an art of exquisite and confounding mysteries, indeed, arguably, a magical medical enterprise on many levels, both at the level of its physical and chemical substrate, as well as to do with the multiple lives of the mind, perceptions, and behaviors. Thus it is, with just these latter dimensions of human existence, that the problems of enduring human mystery presents, as it always and primordially has, and as it insists and presses upon us in entirely new and extraordinary ways today, as florid, psychoactive, and particularly entheogenic compounds are being integrated into active, knowledge-generating protocols in hospitals, ceremonial gatherings, music-based mass events, private experiment, and so on. What do inexact, even diffuse terms like personal, spiritual, religious, and mystical refer to? It's my contention, or should I say hypothesis, that these terms refer to something fully firm and hopefully communicable, indeed something expressible within a fully materialist view of nature, the largest and most constitutive horizon within which the human type was formed and in which it plays out its life. I believe this is the framework within which a theory of experience, hence my title, etc., and hence of our collective destiny may, and indeed today must, be performed and built. Religious, spiritual, mystical, it must first be acknowledged, belong to the realm of actual experience and represent a category of consciousness independent of the specific beliefs, errors, contexts, illusions, illegitimacies, ideas that culturally subtend them. It doesn't matter what's behind them. A revolution in thought. Okay. Interpreters. Skip ahead to the next page. Second paragraph. I'm going to run through some things here very quickly now. I don't want to read the text. Clearly, this is going much slower than I had originally planned also. These are some of the works that from the binge I've been on for the last 16 months that I find to be extraordinarily important. Obviously, begins with William James's Variety of Religious Experience, but these are primarily secularly oriented works. This is an extraordinary work that very rarely is a very rare and unknown work. It predates the work that Leary, Metzner, Ramdas, and the others were doing in the 60s. The work I'm particularly interested in, and an astonishing work, is what I'm going to talk about today, is this one by Stanislav Grof. Yeah, there's these famous work, largely ignored and forgotten today, although coming back, Abraham Maslow, who talked about peak experiences. This is something that I happen to study with hunter-gatherers and their use of trancing and altered states for use to render ever more effective the hunt with a kind of somatic precognition that communicates with the animals that they are seeking to subdue. Now, this work is of particular importance because it's the most recent, and I just want, before I go back to my text, to mention that Strassman did all, he was the only one really who was allowed to do systematic research on DMT in the late 1980s. And basically, he suffered a kind of personal and professional implosion nearing the end of the study when he had to confront the insistent and overwhelming testimony of his often sophisticated and experienced patients that the visions and experiences that they were receiving in his laboratory under the influence of intravenously injected DMT were not representations or hallucinations at all, but that they were real. Obviously, a scientifically trained person was unable to easily accommodate those assertions, but at the same time, and by the way, no psychedelic researcher, regardless of how little they mention their own experience, are without such experience. In fact, the DMT experience, in a way, brought him to a kind of crisis, simply because there was so much evidence, or at least experience, that these were real. Back to my text. The experiences documented and induced in the context of these works systematically fall under the triad of religious, spiritual, mystical, both by the subjects and researchers, because they all report and describe contact. Contact is the most important term here, with a realm of experience beyond individuation. In other words, the experience of a continuity that extends well beyond the sensory, cognitive, and existential boundaries of the subject's strict physical, temporal, and moral location. Or in the conventional lingo, we have to do with the transcendence of separation and distinction and the affective and cognitive complexes that accompany it. It's very complex. I mean, I'm sure most of the room have experienced this in one context or another. It is one of the hardest things to bring back and to transform and to integrate in communicable and in some ways continuously accessible experience, but it is the task, and it's certainly possible. My task, shall I say, is both hubristic perhaps, and maybe also modest, is simply, I do believe that there is a way to communicate it in language. I realized as I made these notes that I was, let me just jump to the graph. Top of page 6. Groff's work in many ways is simply a write-up of his data, an attempt to systematize, describe, and theorize the records of 3,800 supervised LSD sessions with subjects of all types, from seriously disturbed psychiatric patients, through trainee medical practitioners, psychologists, anthropologists, philosophers, artists, etc. Groff worked uniquely with LSD, but from the preponderance of evidence that is today available, in the form of accounts of other entheogen experiments. There are considerable parallels and continuities, such as with high-dose psilocybin, DMT, and several variants of MDMA. For this reason, I present Groff's assessments with caveats as provisionally generalizable to a broad category of psychedelic experience. Groff describes at the outset a broad range of temporal transformations that take place during LSD sessions, from dilation and contraction of time to complex superpositions of multiple temporal flows. The capacity to experience multiple temporalities simultaneously is one of the treats and shocks of psychedelic experience. Sometimes with complete and total arrest of time, as well as fluid travel, particularly to earlier states in one's physical or biological history. Of course, the traveling goes far deeper than that, but I'm going to leave it right now with this. He notes similar lability, changeability in the spatial sphere, particularly a great deal of dynamism and fluctuation, of rarefaction and expansion, condensation, and experience of limitlessness and infinity. More importantly, there is a frequent report of melting and merging into physical extension, often accompanied by feelings of awe, ecstasy, and bliss, or alternately of dread, terror, and death, and often both these sets of feelings at once. Experience of infinity often gives way to similar palpable feeling of eternity, which underscores another significant feature of LSD or psychedelic phenomenology, the non-distinction that frequently presents between formerly separate spatial and temporal dimensions. It is, again, one of the remarkable aspects of experience under hallucinogens to experience time and space as not even distinct, let alone interchangeable. These phenomena are not experienced as paradoxical, but rather as revelations, as a kind of knowledge that, quote, one always, or whether one already always knew. That feeling of being reconnected to an earlier knowledge, specifically in that experience, is one of the most moving experiences of, I think, of the reports, in any case, of great tripping life. In the same vein, a troubling and remarkable constant in high-dose psychedelic research and experience are the manifold ways in which death and rebirth are encountered and often indiscriminately accompanied by a feeling of union and limitless and extended, with a limitless and extended sentient entity. In a certain sense, yes, space and time become alive, or shall we say active. These experiences, once again, and this may be constitutive and the crux of psychedelic phenomena, are pointedly not experienced as paradoxical. The separative or disjunctive experience is entwined with the unifying and conjunctive one in a realm beyond the parcelized and discontinuous space-time matrix in which we spend our normal conscious hours. And this space-time matrix I speak of is both cognitive as well as physical, meaning it applies as much to the external universe as it does to the internal one. Groff's study divides psychedelic experience into four basic frameworks or experiential patterns, with progression between them implied. The first is the abstract and aesthetic experience. The second, the psychodynamic, followed by the perinatal, and finally, the transpersonal one. Had I had time, I would have thrown that up on the PowerPoint for you. It's very, very simple. But the idea is that, especially in very sick patients, is one has to move through them. It's also true that, well, let me first talk here. My own interests, skip the paragraph. The abstract aesthetic refers to the initial phases of an LSD excursion in which intense geometrical imagery, colors, architectures, and movements occur. Faces and their transformations, as well as facialized objects, are a particular feature of this stage. And optic phenomena, a feature of much Stone Age rock art, as well as after images, characterize the closed eye experience, with color and movement predominant in eye-open states, or in open eye states. It has often been remarked at how often pre-Columbian motifs, Aztec, Incan, etc., appear, especially in early stage psilocybin sessions, as well as ancient Hindu and Egyptian forms. Many interpretational paradoxes could certainly ensue. It is my position that these morphological systems are original to the brain's architecture, not parked there later by some pathway of collective unconscious introjection. In other words, you can probably see these much more as the origin of those various forms in history, rather than some way in which they were incorporated later. Groff notes with full agnosticism how subjects with no knowledge of these formal traditions emerge from deep LSD sessions with detailed knowledge of actual historical examples. Hence, the mystery of this replay pageantry remains. Nonetheless, as Groff argues, this first stage of experience is the most trivial, the least profound or revealing, as it is entirely absent of connection to any psychodynamic content or broader cognitive, imaginative, or existential extension. In fact, it's more or less brushed aside. One exception is the remarkable response to music that sometimes accompanies this phase. Subjects report an ability to hear music, quote, as if for the first time, end quote, and as if, quote, with the entirety of one's body, and with an unprecedented, quote, total understanding. I refer to this as a lyrical imminence, and it is a topic of my own research, the details of which I sadly will not be discussing with you today. It wasn't the reason I came to this conference. I just want you to know. Moving on to the second, or psychodynamic stage, I'm just going to summarize it really. Groff introduces the extraordinary term, his own coinage, of the coex system. A coex refers to a system of co-condensed experience. Coex is condensed experience, derived from the actual life of the individual subject. Not only condensed, but annealed, so to speak, even in some cases rendered rigid and obstructive. Coexes can be comprised of both positive or negative experience, although it's most often the negative. The most important thing to note is that the LSD session will invariably take the subject to these fixed islands in their psychic archipelago and will reactivate them for good or ill. Most likely the latter. These coexes are the basis of what in the vernacular is known as a bad trip. But they are also the foundation of the extraordinary efficacy of what was once called LSD psychotherapy. And I certainly agree with Raphael. If you were to read the Roth book and you were to see what they were doing in the 60s, the effectiveness was astounding. There has not been a movement in psychiatry since that can even come close to the results that were achieved under disciplined LSD administration. The codexes are revisited successively on a weekly basis by subject of therapy. Can you imagine doing 100 trips, one a week for 2 years? It was a normal thing in Czechoslovakia when Groff was doing his research. But it was also extraordinarily productive. On a weekly basis by subject to therapists, we lived, worked through until one arrived at the core experience. Once the core experience, which inhabits a coex, is fully removed, the associated coex is effectively, fully, and permanently dissolved and dispensed with. A remarkable aspect of the work in the coexes that I wish to note, particularly for you in this kind of an audience, is that the regressions to earlier ages of the subject that LSD induces always, Groff says, always preserves the material and physical states of the subject to correspond to the age to which the subject has regressed. In other words, things like the proportionality of the head to the body, as in the case, for example, of infants, size of genitalia, breasts, presence or lack of pubic hair, corresponding lack of mature conceptual frameworks, emotional maturity, physical reflexes, developmental stages, and so on, suggesting that such regressions are not imaginative reconstructions, but penetrations into active, existing matrices of matter. I'd like to repeat that, but I don't have time. These places are effectively or seemingly real. And it's particularly that relationship of consciousness and matter, the paradoxes, if you like, the mysteries that are so extraordinary, so fascinating in this literature. Groff reports that once emancipated from a coex, subjects in every case proceeded to the next levels of experience, never returning to the darkness of untangled material again. The psychodynamic level is the level at which the work with patients with grave or complex diagnoses, as well as neurotics, took place. Even those who proceeded successfully through their coexes often moved on smoothly to the level of the perinatal matrices. Okay, we're at the perinatal now. Perinatal refers, very simply, to the time before, during, and just after birth. Groff identifies 4 distinct perinatal matrices, 1 through 4, corresponding to the set of experiences characteristic of each stage, beginning with the minimally eventful but extremely profound period in the equilibrium of the womb. The emergence, second, of the existential biological crisis as the birth event begins. And third, the so-called terminal agony of the death-life struggle once one is compressed in the no-issue birth canal. And finally, perinatal matrix number 4, the catastrophic transition of delivery with its attendant ego-death, followed by expansion, space, light, and overwhelming feelings of love, salvation, redemption, etc. What we're talking about here, of course, is the experiences in LSD sessions. Groff firmly notes elsewhere the likely foundational role that the birth-death conundrum has biologically experienced, if you like, in the psyche and the flesh of one's matrix, shall we say. He says that the birth-death is very likely the root and matrix upon which the so-called mystical experience is built. Much depends, I would argue here, on the specifically, and this is something that Groff could not have known, much depends here on the specifically neurologically open, unformatted, and exquisitely externally oriented nature of the profusely developing nervous system of the newly emerged fetus at the level of 100,000 neural connections per second for the next 6 months. At this stage in its development, the brain is literally imbibing its outer environment and experiencing that very connection and flow as a satisfaction. In some ways, what is fascinating about all of this is that chemical psychiatry, shall we say, theoretical analysis, and neurobiology actually have a place to meet and talk. Basic perinatal matrix, number 1, he calls it BPM. And if you don't mind, I'm going to refer to them more easily from now on as BPM 1 and 4, are the ones that are particularly relevant for pursuing an understanding of what is meant by mystical and spiritual affection or healing. The first point to digest is that birth and death are cognate, the same, indistinct, not only in a conceptual sense, but also as they come to be registered and deposited in our physical and psychic substrates in our bodies. Each can be characterized as a post-crisis resolution, at once at the emotional, philosophical, and physiological levels. Hence the profound and unchallenged union with the mother environment as experienced in the protected, thermally controlled womb of the BPM-1, which is the peaceful, generally undisturbed period where the environment and the it, or the I, are absolutely continuous and at peace. It naturally preempts any subject, object, or self-other cleaving that could support dichotomous awareness, not even the distinction of time and space. There is a very viable and very active nervous system, pulsing, is not the right word, buzzing, you could say, in the womb during this period. It is processing at a rapid rate something. By the way, I'm not anti-abortion, but it's difficult to be pro-abortion. One could even describe this. I didn't plan that remark. I don't know what happened to it. I'd like to delete it, if you don't mind. One could even describe this as an inclusive, cosmic feeling, rooted in flesh, chemistry, and electrical activity. The pathways of nervous perception might also be said to be overwhelmingly tacit and hence intuitional in relation to sensory, in the common understanding of sensory as a reception of external stimuli. The first discernible patterns are sound, music, etc., and they are already present. The sensation of a participatory role in physical and by extension existential reality would at this stage be paramount. Similarly, in BPM 4, after exiting the womb, there is a release from both antagonism and synergy, which characterize the two perinatal matrix states between. Primarily, the synergy and antagonism is with the environment mother, as properly and radically new relationships suddenly being introduced to that entirely new and explosive environment produces an incredible challenge and an excitement. Visual, acoustic, olfactory, gustatory, tactile, but also conceptual. They are explosively forged with the new, now perennially changing and challenging external environment. We're now out in the world, but we're just out in the world. And as one would know from listening to, reading any neurobiology or any lecture that Warren gave, this is when the real massive work of shaping our capacity to interact with the world is formed. Psychedelic re-experiencing of these two states, 1 and 4, often provokes at once a complex aggregate of sensations, annihilation and union, as well as the feeling that one is experiencing the universe for the first time in totally unmediated, direct, totally fresh, new, stimulating, and exciting manner. Once again, as so many of the testimonies seem to say, quote, as if for the first time in their lives. I'm sure many of you have experienced that. The intensity, under experimental conditions. The intensity of sensation and stimulus, accompanied by the deeper background framework of merging with and dying from, combined with the sensation that all these experiences are somehow anchored in one's own intimate flesh or proper substrate, and this substrate is often experienced as intelligence or as energy fields, may well account for what convention and language use denotes as ecstatic or mystico-spiritual or transcendent experience. I see that I don't have much time to report on the most interesting and hopeful stage of all, which is the transpersonal. Although clearly elements of this modality were touched on in both the abstract aesthetic and in the perinatal matrices. By way of summation, allow me two observations that take up certain aspects of transpersonal experience. It's particularly interesting to me because I was really wishing to, in some ways, discuss research into the musical foundations of being. In the difficult, often agonizing and harrowing work that takes place during LSD sessions when engaging the co-exodus, the reliving of interpersonal events that take place, or remembering the events that take place between people in some kind of a social situation, exhibits a particular and very interesting feature. The subject never experiences its own perspective uniquely, but rather always occupies all the personas that were in play in the original scene, in the structure being remembered. The reliving is not a reliving specifically of the subjective memory, but rather a descent into the event itself, an embodying of the event field as a fully possessed material matrix itself, within which the subject was merely a participant. Similarly, Groff notes that, quote, I quote him here, LSD subjects have repeatedly stated that it does not make a difference whether they were oppressor or victims in a negative karmic situation. It appears that it is the dyadic, traumatic pattern that is imprinted, with the emphasis here on pattern. Place I would have wished to go. Pattern. The way our lives, as well as the material world, is an interplay of patterns. And that, fundamentally, is one of the things that the psychedelic experience brings to awareness. Aware that I'm jumping several steps, I suggest that the sovereign subject position bias that we assume in every one of our normal moments on Earth, what Alfred North Whitehead might call the false doctrine of simple location. You hardly needed that, but for me it's very important to have Whitehead in the mix here, is a distortion of the natural order of things, a mere artifact of an adapted life form, that is us, humans, condemned to making an efficient living in the physical world. Consciousness is a broader, more formless extension that finds its correlate and complement in the mysterious, infinitely encoded world of matter, both living and not. One of the occasions that psychedelic experience provides is the momentary activation of this archaic and profoundly imbricated relationship between matter and consciousness, which is also a non-paradoxical experience. The second and last summary point I want to introduce, the problem of music, that I faintly hoped might have turned out to be the topic I would discuss today. Every human culture, without exception, has and uses music, but we do not know from where this music comes. Music is at once vibration and duration, and almost certainly accesses parts of us singly and collectively far beyond where we ourselves can deliberately go. We use music compulsively for its psychotropic properties. We modulate ourselves throughout our lives and throughout any given day. It is not reducible to tone or rhythm, nor to any other component that makes up its mysterious structure and flow. But patterned sound arguably represents the original stimulus around which the already massively encephalized human organism organized its self. The first intimate sensorial signals, of course, were the periodic cycling of the heartbeat and the breath of the mother, soon followed by the vibrations of her speech. We know, for example, that newborn brains, already 18 hours out of the mother's womb, are already tuned to the mother's and father's native languages. And yet later, by environmental sounds that penetrated the layers of the womb. In sum, the scaffold upon which the human organism constructs all subsequent shells of its self is the perception of organized sound, a matrix arguably formed and anchored in the substrate of the perinatal matrices, and hence linked forever in our ontogenetic selves to the emotional, affective, sensorial capacities that are connected to them. So, in summary, and by way of exit today, I would like to comment on the intellectual habit we cultural producers have cultivated over the last decades, that of duty-bound demystifiers of false mysteries. But what about the true mysteries? Are we so confident that none exist? We are all aware of the longer history of how science progressively, and the word we use in English is disenchanted the universe, primarily nature itself, by slipping a veil of numbers and quantities over it, and this for hundreds of years. But in our more recent contemporary, in fact, world, where the platitudes of demystification have become so routine, familiar, and allied with power and market forces, and hostile to true, maybe even radical imagination, it seems as if the fevers of matter, of consciousness, and the true boundarylessness of experience have found an ally in the revival of exploratory practices rooted in both the plant and laboratory world of psychoactive compounds, but also in the infinite realm of psychic and somatic disciplines, yoga, exercise, meditation, etc., where psychotropy becomes a significant tool in an arsenal that is in every sense a necessary and urgent and fully ecological project for us today. Thank you.